framework is needed to trigger investments in the integrated energy transition. The Paris Agreement has set the world on a path to meet a well below 2 degrees Celsius rise in temperature. To meet this goal, investments into the energy transition of roughly $3.5 trillion per year are needed. Fossil fuel subsidies amount to considerably more, $5 trillion per year. The bulk of all energy investments still goes into the fossil fuel sector. So sufficient funds are available, but they are locked in. Investments and financial streams need to be aligned with the objective of accelerating the energy transition in all sectors.
Libby Wayman. Libby Wayman is from Breakthrough Ventures. We'll talk about what she's doing in a moment, but first she's going to give us a short introduction as kind of a kickoff to this session. Libby, please.
Great. Good morning. Climate change represents the greatest challenge of our time. And today we're at the dawn of a global transition to a clean economy. In the electricity sector, after decades of investment in cleaner technology, R&D, and deployment, renewable energy technologies are now cost competitive without subsidies. In the last few years, we've reached an important milestone where over half of the new energy generation technology added to the grid is renewable energy. This represents over $300 billion in annual investment since around 2011. But this is just the start. Around 100 gigawatts of solar were added in the last year, around over 50 gigawatts of wind and beyond. Yet we're adding these renewable energy technologies to a grid with about 6 terawatt of energy generation capacity. So we're really just scratching the surface, both in the installed base and relative to the trillions of dollars of investment that this opportunity represents. And we also must look beyond the electricity sector. In the last year, less than 1% of global sales of vehicles were electric vehicles. Even out to 2040 and 2050 timeframe, it's anticipated that electric vehicle sales will account for 35 to 50% of new vehicle sales. Some estimates even project that more internal combustion engine vehicles will be on the road in 2040 and 2050 than there are today. Beyond transportation and electricity, if we think about the buildings that we live in, if we reduce energy consumption in buildings by 20%, that represents over 2 gigatons of CO2 emissions reduction. And in manufacturing, only 3 sectors of manufacturing make up 5 gigatons of annual emissions: concrete, steel, and chemicals. And across the whole manufacturing sector, it's around 15 gigatons. But beyond electricity generation and energy consumption, we also have to think about the food on our tables and the agricultural industry that brings it there. If cows were a country, just cows, just annual dairy and beef production, that would represent the emissions of basically the third largest nation. The 5 largest food producers in the world are responsible for emissions that are equivalent to the largest independent oil and gas company. So we have a lot of work to do, and the electricity sector, I think, is a very promising start, but it's just a start. Innovators, from entrepreneurs, business leaders around the world, need to continue their efforts in scientific technologies, breakthroughs in technologies and business models that can generate both business model innovation and cost-competitive technologies in these sectors across the economy. The public sector and the private sector have a role to play, and I look forward to discussing that on the panel.
Thanks very much, Libby. That lays out the big picture with some sobering facts. We also heard yesterday from Fatih Birol that the challenge ahead of us is quite immense, and So maybe we can get some good ideas going among you on how we can move that forward. Libby, I'll start with you since you just gave that presentation. You are an investment partner with Breakthrough Ventures. It's an investor-led fund that focuses on new energy technologies, maybe not just energy technologies and venture capital funds. And you, like I think everyone in the panel, has both public and private sector experience. You served as global director of GE's Eco-Imagination Innovation, which I think invests $20 billion in clean innovation. And you, in between roles, you worked for the US State Department as founding director of the Clean Energy Manufacturing Initiative. So your insights from both with your public and your private hat will be very valuable. Then to you, Natalia Boyko. You're Deputy Minister of European Integration in the Ministry of Energy and Coal Industry of Ukraine. And before that, you worked as Energy Reform Manager on the National Council for Reforms, which was chaired by the President of Ukraine. And so we'll want to hear about about Ukraine and then Europe and the EU are collaborating. And I don't want to be remiss and not mention that Natalia Boyko was, in 2017, was among the top 30, under 30, a prize that was awarded by the Kiev Post to young Ukrainians who achieved outstanding results in a variety of sectors. So congratulations to you on that. Then I'll go to Mr. Tabane Zulu, Director General of Department of Energy for the Republic of South Africa. You've been in that post since 2015. And before that, you were Director General of the Department of Human Settlements, and before that, Executive Director of Business Development at African Access. So you too have the public and the private experience. And you also, and I really want to get into this later, you worked for the South African Local Government Association, and you told me before you were also municipal manager. And so I hope we get to touch on the experience from the local government perspective and what needs to be done there. And then finally, Mr. Andrew McDowell, Vice President of the European Investment Bank, which you joined in 2016, responsible for energy and agriculture lending and economic relations with 10 European and 15 Asian countries. And you're the first Irish member of the Bank's Management Committee, I have here. And you were an economic advisor to the Prime Minister of Ireland. And the EIB, being the world's largest multilateral lender and largest provider of climate-related investment. We're very, very happy and honored to have you join us today on this session. So, with those introductions, we can get going, but before we do that, I'm going to invite Mr. Dialogue onto the stage, whom I know is Mr. Craig Morris, but today and yesterday he's Mr. Dialogue. Craig, what can you tell us about the Twitter activity and how
well, first of all, of course, we have the hashtag that I'd like to ask you to use. And over here, if we can get the QR code up once again, there's a different code for every question that we ask over at Mentimeter. So please point your device in that direction. Or if you can't do that with a laptop or something, just enter the URL and the code. And some people were telling me yesterday at the end of the event, they said, Craig, you're being kind of polite here, aren't you? I mean, aren't there some more critical tweets out there? Okay, maybe I was being a little bit polite because we had all the ministers and the important people here, but today it's the second day of the conference and it's just us, right? We're all friends, so we can speak more openly. I had one tweet that came in after I presented the results yesterday, the last time I was on stage, that I thought was wonderful. We had asked the audience, would you be willing to pay more for a coal exit? And someone wrote in and said, come on, you're more enlightened than this. Why are you equating a coal exit with higher costs? And I thought, that's a good question to talk about. But it was too late because I had already left the stage. So here's the thing. I need you to go there now. take a look at the questions and go ahead and start firing off some things using this hashtag, because I'm monitoring that account, that hashtag. And then I will come up here and we can bounce some of your questions and criticism off of what the panel has been saying as well. Okay, that's the whole idea. So I'll be back in a half hour or so. Enjoy the presentation. Virginia, I'm handing off to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Craig. Thank you, Mr. Dialogue. We'll look forward to getting that feedback. Natalia Boyko. May I call you Natalia?
Of course.
Tell us what changes are taking place in Ukraine right now in the energy sector in terms of the energy transition.
Thank you very much. Is it working? Yeah, perfect. Probably now is the most challenging and changing period in Ukraine's energy sector ever, because currently we have different challenges that are connecting with our political situation and new course that Ukraine was choosing 5 years ago. That means Euro integration. But at the same time, we're trying to achieve all important goals that the other countries are challenging now. We was in the top 10 countries who adopt the Paris Agreement, and it was ratified in Ukraine. We are working now on the joint agenda for energy and environmental sectors, what I think is important, and we understand that decarbonization is the key answer on our future development. But let me start from 5 years ago. 5 years ago, we started the new agenda for Ukraine, and Ukrainians choose the Euro integration as a main importance way for our country. And in energy sector, that was extremely complicated because Ukraine was always connecting from the source base and the roads base in energy sector with Russia Federation. And the new strategy for the country was to change the course and to choose all important energy independence measures to achieve the Euro integration. So what we are doing now? Currently, we are finalizing implementation of the third energy package. We need to create the market relations on the both market, electricity and gas market in Ukraine, and to have the same regulation as European countries. At the same time, we choose the very strong priority. We are making the integration of both our markets from the infrastructure perspective to Europeans. That's why we have a very strong reform that is connecting with integration with Europe in our gas sphere and electricity sphere. But that's a base. So to achieve the future goals and to start to work with important tasks, first we need to make the basis think. So the task number one is resilience of our system. And here achieving goals connecting with energy independence and energy security, because, for example, when we're talking about energy security in Ukraine, we have also such a question as in the cyber security. At least one per year, we have a huge cyber attack on our critical infrastructure in the energy sector. That's also connecting with complicated geopolitical situation. But what interesting is, we are trying to achieve important goals, for example, with increasing of renewables. We have a pretty ambitious target to achieve 11% till 2020. But what does it mean for the old-fashioned post-Soviet energy system? When we're talking about electricity system, we are covering now around 55% with the nuclear generation. We have a huge consumption in the coal sector. We have not very high percent of big hydro generation, and we are growing day by day, year by year, our renewable sector that is now supported with a very high feed-in tariff system. But for the energy system, that means that we need the balancing capacities, because currently in Ukraine we have such a paradox that we are increasing renewables, we are very proud on that, we are very green, feel very good. At the same time, we are increasing coal consumption to balance the renewables for the system, and we are shocked. because currently we understand that in the future we will probably use more storage technologies, we will develop different technologies for the balancing the system, we are trying to develop the smart grid technologies for the networks, but actually now the benefit of greens looks not very beneficial for that targets that we are trying to achieve. So we start to analyze how the growing of renewables is impacting on resilience on our system, on our network situation, of our current generation sources, etc., etc. And we have a couple of answers. First answer is decentralization. So I think that in the future, the possible small generation, especially renewable generation, also for the locals, for the region, will be very beneficial. And for the general system, we need to develop the new mechanism how to support the small decentralized generation. The second answer is, of course, we will probably develop also the big hydro more, because in one hand, of course, we know that we need to be very carefully with environmental impact assessment, but still we are not allowed to increase the coal consumption. And one more important thing, what we need to achieve is, of course, to even to currently use of coal, consumption of coal need to be clean. And here the final answer on these questions is investment and financing. In Ukraine we have a lot of investors who are working with solar and wind. We have a high financial system. Ukrainian banks even from time to time are providing better programs, and as for example EBRD. So our Ukrgazbank has like a green line credit for solar and biogas, and they are more beneficial and cheaper as EBRD program. So here we have growing projects, but at the same time that doesn't answering the question of the balancing capacities. The situation with gas is a bit complicated, so to build new balancing generation, for example, gas pump generation, we need to find investment, and any bank in Ukraine, any international bank, don't like to make any beneficial line for the balancing capacities. The only discussion that we have with your colleagues in Ukraine, with the World Bank colleagues, and with the EBRD colleagues is about support of big hydro. So that's the line that they are ready to support. So we're challenging different questions, but at the same time, I think that important thing is that we all need to have a very concrete points from the low carbon development points, and step by step to work on that agenda.
Thanks very much for that. 11% renewables by 2020.
Yes.
That's like tomorrow. But we'll...
The brief comment.
Yes.
Here we have one complicated thing. The target was pointed when we was with the whole independent Ukrainian territory. So Crimea was annexed by Russians, and we lost solar generation there, we lost energy infrastructure, we lost capacity there. East is also now under the conflict with Russians, and we also lost capacities in generation there, especially closer to the sunny regions. Politically, it's incorrectly now to put new targets. I think that we need to still to keep the line that we are the unique country and we need to achieve our targets. But yes, geopolitical situation a bit cut our ambitious plans.
But yes, so stay ambitious. We need that. And you've Ukraine's joined IRENA, hasn't it?
Yes,
yeah,
it is,
okay.
and we are pretty active.
Good, very good. Thanks very much, Natalia. Let me move to Tabane Zulu from South Africa, because some things are similar. We have a lot of coal, and let's paint out the picture that you have in South Africa right now for us. Tabane.
Thank you very much, Virginia. Ministers, deputy ministers, ambassadors, and also my ambassador present, Mr. Stonesizan. Thanks very much for gracing us with your presence. From a South African perspective, I think one could indicate that we have a population of 55 million people, and I'm sure that the majority of you will know that from 1994, South Africa began a new journey of a democratic dispensation that changed the landscape politically and economically of how the country wanted to move forward. And obviously, energy is one area that our government had to pay a special attention in terms of managing a new perspective to deal with the new challenges that the country was faced with. It then gave us an opportunity to look into our integrated resource plan, which our government adopted a new energy mix policy in 2008, and in 2010 our government introduced a new IRP plan, which was reflecting on our energy mix as a policy for government. Historically, Eskom, our utility, has always played a very dominant role in our industry for the supply of electricity generation, using our national endowment, which is coal. And coal is one of the most influencing production of electricity in our country through the utility of Eskom. With the introduction of our integrated resource plan in 2010, which was basically reflecting on the energy mix that the government wanted to focus, it changed the whole strategic arrangement of providing electricity generation in our country, which was a very exciting process that government adopted. However, that did not come without challenges, as you will know, and it's also important to indicate that South Africa is a signatory of the Paris Climate Agreement, and one of the reasons why we had to look into the energy mix was to create a space for the use of renewables as one alternative of supplying electricity in our country. This was a new game changer in our environment. This is something that has never been done before, and the government decided to introduce Independent Power Producers Office, which was an office that was tasked with the responsibility of introducing renewables in our country. You can then imagine the excitement and the challenges that brought into our country. And what was very interesting is that international community, in particular those with various technologies, started to pay special attention in our industry, in the renewable space. But obviously, Eskom, as a standard practice, had to review its own strategy of competing with the new approach of introducing renewables. And that on its own has always been a challenge. It remains a challenge. It's very interesting, though, that our Independent Power Producers Office was able to attract huge investments from international community, particularly companies that had different technologies in the renewable space, such as wind, such as solar. And one can also indicate that in that process, we were able to attract investment in our country of 195 billion rands, 56 billion US dollars in our industry of renewables. And this was one of the strategic areas in our integrated resource plan to begin to create a space for renewables in our industry. This was one of the key procurement strategies that we put in place. And what was interesting is how the international community responded in this particular investment area in terms of the financing strategies. Of course, that did not come without challenges. As you'll know, that South Africa has never been involved in this place before, and also the technologies that were being brought into our space were not of original nature, so they were transferred from those countries. So the challenges were mainly around the skills transfer, the financing model, and the localization content strategy, how to make sure that you accommodate the local content without necessarily shifting the investments away, and how also to comply with the conditions, financial conditions that some of the investors, they were imposing in our local space. And that was for us a big challenge. But be that as it may, what is interesting is that we're able to put a strategy for the role of the local players, for the role of the international investors, and for the role of the technologies that were being brought about into our space. As we speak today, in our national grid, since we started in 2010, we have 6,400 megawatts that has been brought into our national grid in the renewable space. It does two things. It relaxes pressure on our national grid, but it also makes us to comply with our commitment we have made in the Paris Agreement for climatic change as we use renewables.
Good.
So that was our great achievement we have made. And as we revisit currently our integrated resource plan, we have no doubt whatsoever that the renewables will continue to play a very important strategic role in the supply of our generation. And we look forward to the finalization of that process and to attract more investments in the space and relax the challenge that our national grid is faced with at the moment. That's why now and again in South Africa you have load shedding. It's because our grid is faced with a demand that it cannot supply. And our savior, therefore, is renewables. Thank you.
That deserves an applause. Congratulations on that. And we'll talk more about those challenges and we get into the detail of that. But now we go to the finance side of the panel. And we start with you, Andrew McDowell. Given that the public sector isn't going to be able to foot the bill, as we say, to provide the financing that's needed. How can the public sector then, what's their role in directing finance in that capital steerage towards the clean energy transition? Not just renewables, but in the whole space.
Thank you, Virginia. Good to be in Berlin. A brief introduction to the European Investment Bank. We're the EU bank, owned by the still 28 member states of the European Union. We're 60 years old. We finance while the initial capital comes from the member states, we finance ourselves in the global capital markets. So we don't take taxpayers' money every year. We raise our bonds every year. And over 60 years, we've become the largest multilateral financing institution in the world. With a balance sheet of about 600 billion, we're about twice the size of the World Bank. Now, most of that financing goes into, about 90% into the European Union itself, financing infrastructure, innovation, SMEs, and so on. But about 10%, and in fact an increasing proportion, goes outside of the European Union, including in South Africa and Ukraine. We have built up a huge energy business. So energy is about 20% of our business, energy financing. Mainly renewable energy and energy efficiency is about 2/3 of the energy business. So we do about 12 to 14 billion of energy projects off our own balance sheet every year. With most of that, as I say, about 80% of that is renewable energies, wind and solar, energy efficiency, so it's clean energy. And then we do obviously networks also, both power and gas. And then we do a little bit of thermal generation, not much anymore, but we do a little bit of gas-fired generation. We haven't touched coal in about 15, 20 years. We're very proud of our role in the energy transformation. I mean, we pioneered green bonds. We were the first ever issuer of green bonds in 2007 with our climate awareness bond. We're still the largest issuer of green bonds in the world, and really we feel we have set the standard for green bond issuance. We pioneered the financing of the offshore wind industry in Europe. So about 40% of all offshore wind in Europe has been financed by the EIB. And again, we set the standard for how to structure and prepare an offshore wind project for financing, to the point now where obviously the private sector is now taking over the job and relieving us of our requirement to finance it. We really do regard ourselves as the EU's climate bank for this reason. Many of you may have seen President Macron wrote a letter recently to the citizens of Europe in advance of the European elections, setting out an agenda for Europe in terms of further integration and further cooperation among the member states. And he set out a vision for the creation of an EU climate bank. And we want to be the institution that delivers on that vision of being the EU's climate bank. As I say, we've done an awful lot, but there's a lot of areas where we need to improve. We need to do an awful lot more. And that's why we're actually reviewing our energy lending policies at the moment in the light of the new commitments that have been made by the European Commission and the European Union under the Paris Climate Agreement, the new vision for net zero carbon emissions by 2050. We are now consulting on our energy lending policies about how to achieve that vision. And some of the questions that we're asking ourselves are the ones that you're asking me now, which is, when you look at the investment requirements in the EU alone over this period, we're talking about 400 billion a year in the 2020s, rising further into the 2030s to get to a place of net zero emissions by 2050. How do we fill that gap? Half of that is going to be in energy efficiency, half of that investment requirement. I mean, we're doing about 4 billion a year in energy efficiency financing ourselves, so financing projects of about 10 billion a year. That's fine, but the gap is enormous. How do we crowd in others? How do we get promoters to prepare better projects to help crowd in the private sector? How do we develop energy efficiency as an asset class that brings in the $10 trillion out there in asset managers into this asset class? How do we fill the gap in risk capital for the development and commercialization and deployment of new technologies? It's a huge issue, particularly in Europe, also in the United States, but particularly in Europe. And we're looking forward to working with partners in this particular challenge, because traditional VC does not do energy tech commercialization and deployment. I mean, when it takes 10 years to go from demonstration to full deployment, you're not going to get a lot of VC into that type of market. So we need a new model, and we need to work with new partners to develop a model to fill that gap. How do we finance renewables when it's shifting from feed-in tariffs to merchant risk? I mean, this is a huge challenge. If we're going to have to triple, quadruple potentially renewable power generation in Europe, but the states are pulling back from feed-in tariffs, how do you do that on a merchant basis? And we're working now with the private sector and with the financial industry about how to set the standard for those type of projects. Outside of Europe, we want to really increase our presence in terms of renewable energy generation. I mean, we do think Europe has been a leader in a lot of markets. We want to bring that experience in project preparation and finance to our partner countries all over the world. And in doing so, crowding in other private sector financiers, because this is the big challenge, particularly outside of Europe. So we are developing new products outside of Europe in terms of political risk guarantees, new guarantee products for off-takers in terms of removing off-take risk for renewable power generators. We're working with the World Bank, we're working with the IFC, we're working with the EBRD in those markets where we share a common jurisdiction, to set a new standard for how to finance renewable energy generation in those countries. But the challenge is immense. There's a lot of individual institutions, but we need to work together as a system in order to try and mobilize the amounts of capital that are going to be required.
Thank you. You said 400 billion per year?
Just in Europe.
In Europe.
Just in Europe, yeah.
That almost sounds like, compared to the trillions and bazillions that we're hearing, that almost sounds manageable. I wanted to get back on the energy efficiency, because energy efficiency has always been considered the easiest, no-brainer, low-hanging fruit, also in all of the climate negotiations going way back, and it was always energy efficiency, that's doable, But Fatih Birol from the IEA said yesterday, it's far too low, too weak. You're saying the investments in energy efficiency need to be worked on. Do you have sort of a strategy you think that could trigger this off?
Yeah, so, okay, I'm delighted you asked me that, because we're actually working on this with Fatih Birol. So we've set up with the IEA a new MDB energy efficiency platform, where all the MDBs are going to, the World Bank, the EBRD, the Islamic Development, but all the major MDBs are coming together to look at common standards when it comes to, and products and instruments when it comes to energy efficiency financing. For our part in the IB, there's a number of areas we're prioritizing. First of all, we want to develop a much bigger energy performance contracting market in Europe, and there's a whole range of issues, including statistical treatment of energy performance contracts under government accounting. The United States is a market about 10 times the size of Europe when it comes to ESCOs and EPCs, so that's a big challenge. So we're working on that. We want to develop green mortgages as an asset class. We're working with the private banks on this, and we have a whole network now of about 30 private banks who are looking at the standards required for green mortgages. What makes a mortgage a green mortgage in terms of the level of energy efficiency improvements required? And we'd love to develop an asset class. So in other words, we'd love to develop the first securitized European green mortgage to bring in asset managers into this particular area. We want to work with local authorities and the public sector, particularly in terms of the preparation of projects for the public sector, not just under energy performance contracts, but more generally. We have 100 million to deploy in grant aid in terms of technical assistance and financial structuring that we can bring to the European public sector, to municipalities all across Europe. We've had some great success stories in Romania, for example. We've financed the retrofit of about 200,000 apartments now in Bucharest to bring them to the highest standards. But we need to do this in a lot more jurisdictions. So energy efficiency, I think, is going to be the one nut we really have to crack if we're going to meet the targets that have been set under the Paris Accords. Yeah.
Thanks very much. Libby Wayman, move from the bank to the venture capital sector. We'd like to hear about the fund that you're partnering in, and the work you're doing both in the US and outside.
Yes, absolutely. And Breakthrough Energy is just absolutely thrilled to be here. Thank you, Virginia. Thank you, dignitaries and ministers, for having us. Breakthrough Energy really is an initiative led by Bill Gates and several other global business leaders who are entrepreneurs and industry leaders themselves, and also a number of corporations and a number of governments around the world. Breakthrough Energy Ventures is the venture investment arm of that, and it is a over $1 billion venture fund that is invested in by some of our coalition members, so some of the largest entrepreneurs and business leaders around the world. And we invest in any innovation across the entire economy that can make a significant reduction in carbon emissions, while also representing the possibility to become a large and profitable business that defines the future of the economy, and then thereby represents an important investment opportunity for us as a fund. Part of our thesis here is that if we and other investors that we work with can continue to invest in this sector and demonstrate top-tier venture returns compared to all other venture funds, that we will attract additional capital to this sector and open up the opportunity to bring in the trillions of dollars that are needed, not only in innovation, but then in deployment through these other mechanisms. We're also a 20-year fund, so we have the timeline to invest in early stage technologies and take them through several years of de-risking and development to enable them to be ready for deployment. We also, most of us are located in the US. However, we invest globally. We are a global fund. We've made investments in the US, Canada, Australia, Sub-Saharan Africa, Europe, and we are just getting started. We just started deploying capital in 2018, so we're also looking at many other regions around the world. And then we're also working with other regions around the world in a public-private partnership sort of model. Earlier this fall, we actually announced a joint fund with the European Commission led by the Investment Bank for 100 million euro joint fund to be invested here in Europe as well. And so we see our role as finding really dedicated entrepreneurs who are committed to solving some of the toughest challenges on our planet and helping them build companies, develop innovations and technologies and business models, and get them into market. And then we work with other partners to help deploy these technologies in different markets around the world.
Very good. Thanks very much, Libby. So you'll be looking to leverage that fund as you proceed with the public funding as well. So that's a good,
absolutely
good model. So with that, at the end of the first round, I will ask Mr. Dialogue to come back onto the stage and tell us what he's been hearing or reading.
All right, so maybe we can get the results up for the Menti questions. We had very good participation. I think there were more than 80 people who participated, and we've actually got so many good questions, 20 at least. I'm only going to be able to handle about 5 or 6 of them. Oh, I forgot my little flicker there. Maybe I can get that as well. The first question was, what will trigger investments in the energy transition? And the answer that you say is a price on carbon. And we have an interesting question in line with that, but I'll come back to that in just a minute. To accelerate the transition to renewables, governments should focus on policies that increase returns, carbon price, taxes, and subsidies. So once again, we're back to the carbon price. Some of you are still participating, I can see. And the effects of the real risks of stranded assets, carbon bubble, will be felt in the early 20s, or it is already happening. So, I mean, if you add those up, we probably should have put it is already happening all the way over on the left. And then you would have really been able to see that it's all short term. There's agreement in this room, at least, that all of this is basically either happening now or just in the next few years. Now, if I can switch over for the technicians to the tweets. We have a very good one here from Karim, who asks, what are the barriers for carbon prices? So if carbon prices are so great, why don't we already have them? Okay, I mean, we do actually have them in many jurisdictions, in the EU, for instance, but the price is also not high enough. So maybe we can also tweak that question to say, why don't we have high enough carbon prices? So that would be a good question to discuss, possibly, yes?
Except that there's a session solely on carbon pricing after this session, so I think we'll
postpone that one? Okay. We got quite a bit of a discussion about the Ukraine. So Sifo Kings was very impressed about the cyber attacks on the infrastructure. But we actually also had a bit of pushback. I'm just going to show one of those tweets. Carl Zicella, I believe, says, better grid coordination with EU grid operators could provide balancing services for Ukraine from renewables. Taking advantage of geographic diversity and northern hydro, don't go it alone. And there was a general consensus that simply saying we need fossil fuels to back up renewables somehow wasn't satisfactory. And I also wanted to close with this one. So here we have one. This is a retweet. I haven't been doing too many retweets, but when it's Yanis Varoufakis, you make an exception. I assume he's not in the room here. But I thought it was interesting that, oops, this is now in a loop. Let me put that one back up. This is actually in German, which tells me two things. First of all, Janis is able to access German, and And second, we're reaching a wide audience. That's also something to remember with Twitter, that we actually reach a lot of people. But this one is about the European Investment Bank, and Dein Europa has actually asked, why doesn't the European Investment Bank go ahead and devote 500 billion euros a year to the transition? I wonder if someone on the panel could respond to that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dialogue. Yeah, I wonder if someone on the panel could respond to that. You want to give it a go?
As I say, we're already financing more for the energy transition than any other multilateral. So we are a big bank, but we like any bank, we don't have infinite amounts of risk-taking capital. And absolutely central to our business model is keeping our AAA rating so we can raise funds extremely cheaply in the global markets, not for our benefit because we're not a profit-making institution, but in order to pass on those low financing costs and long tenors to the project promoters. I would love to dramatically expand what we can do in the energy transition. But I would say two things about it. I mean, one obviously is the limits that our shareholders are willing to provide us in terms of fresh capital. The second thing is it's about finding the right projects. I mean, if I was able to report back to our shareholders that I've got, you know, a 200 billion euro pipeline of fantastic energy transition projects that meet all of our standards, we just don't have the capital, we could have an interesting conversation. But in fact, we don't. We don't have those projects. The projects need to be prepared, and this is just in relation to the question on carbon taxation and carbon pricing. I'm a fundamental believer in the value of carbon pricing, and we've seen with the European emissions trading system, when the price goes up, emissions go down. It's absolutely clear. The system works. But in the non-ETS sectors, in the domestic sectors, where obviously it's a very politically sensitive issue around carbon taxation, I think the politicians are aware it's not just about the price. It's about the ability to get particularly small-scale consumers and SMEs in a position to prepare projects. You can raise carbon taxation all you like, but already we see energy efficiency projects with very high rates of economic return and short payback, but nobody's doing them. And nobody's doing them because they don't know how. They don't have the technical capacity to prepare the projects. The banks don't know how to finance them. The models aren't there. You've got split incentives between landlords and tenants. You've got myopia. You've got the lack of understanding. There is a huge amount of work that we need to do before we can just say, jack up the price and everything will be fine. So I'd love to do 500 billion, but the 500 billion of projects within Europe is just not there right now, and we need to do an awful lot of work in preparing the projects.
So we're still not linking the supply and the demand. We're not matching that. But it's also enabling environment as well, isn't it? Not only just the project preparation. We've been hearing that also for 15 years. We have the money, we don't have the projects. So another nut to crack. You wanted to add to that, Tabani?
I'm very happy that Andrew has made the kind of comments that he has made. Our experience in the South African context from bid windows 1, 2, 3, and 4, procuring renewables for solar and wind, has been exactly what he's saying. The level of preparation is not always up to scratch. So there are various elements in preparation that are not taken cognizance of to make sure that bankability, which is always a key area of focus, is then addressed. The training component, the skills transfer, the technologies that is making reference to, which at times are very complicated in nature, it requires preparation prior to implementation. And this is a challenge we have had. As a result, during implementation stage, it's only when you begin to deal with those challenges, which make it very difficult for the technologies to be well received and well implemented. But if, in particular, potential investors, the creation and innovation of the technologies, it's done properly in the preparatory stage, that will make life easier moving forward. And that will make life easier for also potential bankers to make sure that they fund those projects, and you then attract SMMEs, you then attract localization content to make sure that there is no negative criticism during the implementation. That is absolutely fundamental. In my input earlier on, Virginia, I said there have been challenges, and some of the challenges is what Andrew is referring to. Moving forward, which we are going to do, in our integrated resource plan currently, we have identified 14,000 megawatts that must be attracted into the wind, 6,000 into the solar. And our lessons is that all the preparatory work, all elements of preparation must be addressed effectively prior to implementation so that the risk that you're identifying, Andrew, is dealt with prior to implementation, and all elements of localization, training, technologies are then well received during the implementation stage. That's a lesson we have learned in the last 8 years of the implementing of renewables.
Before I get to Natalia, you want to add to that, Libby?
The one other thing I'd say is that we have to look beyond the public sector or big banks to solve this problem alone through large, bankable, huge projects. The energy sector is really where we've made a lot of progress, and there's a convenient aspect of the energy sector. It went through deregulation in many parts around the world, opening up the possibility for banks to get involved, for private sector investors to get involved. There are large central projects or smaller securitizable projects. There's been a lot of financial innovation in the last 20 to 30 years that have enabled banks and private sector investors to participate. But outside of that sector, there's a lot of work to do to open those sectors to even banks and large-scale investments. I'm really excited about the work that you mentioned on energy efficiency financing. Those projects are typically much smaller compared to large central or many distributed energy projects that are securitizable. So I think there's a lot of financial innovation that's needed there, and that can open the sector to banks and other investors that can be facilitated by bankers. But then if we think beyond that to individual choices that consumers make, again, mentioning just the food that's on our tables. We have to look to innovative products, innovative offerings to consumers as well that can direct just the choices that people make with their wallet into superior products, superior services that can also reduce carbon emissions. And so we have to get beyond just what we can do with huge projects and big checks to true innovations that can be pervasive across the economy and across different types of investors, so to speak.
Good.
I'd like to add for energy efficiency. In Ukraine, for example, we create the energy efficiency fund supported by actually German government, European Union, and also the 50% was covering by Ukrainian government. So the main point is that we'd like to collect not just typical programs and typical solutions that we are providing in energy efficiency sector, but also to collect different type of technologies, and we're trying to involve different companies that can provide solution in one place. And here I think that's a nice way how the state can support this on the very high state priority political level. So that was our solution. We'll see how we will develop that, because still we have, for example, warm loans from the state banks. We have IQ Energy program from EBRD. So in Ukraine, the energy efficiency is now highly prioritized, and we have different solutions in financial and technical sector to support this priority. That's one point. The second point, I'd like to support my colleagues with the discussion about technologies. And we get this feeling during our discussion with generation. From time to time, the main answer on different questions and problem is we don't have experience, we don't have partners which have right experience, and we don't know how to find the better solution. And the take of the way of solution finding from time to time is very long, because when you're trying to really to push your generation, for example, to be much more low carbon and much more clean, actually they are very worried about environmental impact assessment on each project that they need to develop. They are very carefully trying to find the right partners with the right experience, and that's a question. So I think leapfrogging is now a bit complicated because of technologies, but in energy sector we have such a quick development of any solutions that maybe in next year we will have here the different discussion around some new solutions and new technologies that will change all sectors of energy might be. And brief comment about the cyber. So because I saw the reaction about Ukraine. Yes, Ukraine is last 4 years at the first line of the cyber attacks. That's why we have a great experience. Last big cyber attack, we spent even blackout and was very proud about that. So great work of our system operator, great unit work of the ministry and all stakeholders. But that's, once again, the answer is technologies. In one hand, technologies are friend. At the other hand, technologies are actually making problems, and for example, for us, we developed a complex modernization program for our substations and lines. At the same time, we see that from time to time, all good solutions are answered during the cyber attacks, and they can keep security for us to back up some important things. Thank you.
Interesting. Okay. Since we've been talking a lot about energy efficiency, which I think is a good thing, the local level, the local government level, there's such a huge potential at the local government level for these projects. I mean, local government, that's where people live. They're the ones that have the buildings. They're the ones that have the transport systems, et cetera, et cetera. But they say that they're not getting the funds. And I was at a workshop in South Africa years ago where the people from the government were saying, we know that our local governments are doing great things, but we don't know how to get the funds to them. And EIB, I'm sure, Andrew, you have something to say about that as well. I don't know if you're doing any work at the local level in Ukraine. So any ideas on how we can improve on that, on getting funds from the national level into the communities, into the local government level, municipalities, towns, etc.? Who wants to start on that?
Just from a financing perspective, I mean, I mentioned energy performance contracting in ESCOs as one model where we're trying to develop the capacity of local government and municipalities to, so in some ways, it's about bringing in private sector skills to manage projects, but it also helps overcome some budget restrictions if you can move the debt off the public balance sheet into the private sector balance sheet and move the risk into the private sector as well. And repay the debt, obviously, out of the savings from energy efficiency. Just to say, for a lot of municipalities, there's two issues. There's budget restrictions and there's financing restrictions. I mean, we have to distinguish between these concepts. So a lot of municipalities can potentially borrow, or some can borrow, but they're budget capped. So that's an issue that needs to be worked out nationally, as to what the appropriate level of space, fiscal space, to provide municipalities to invest in the energy transition is. Where though there is budget space, but they're financing constrained, we can help with that. Obviously, we can provide long-term financing to municipalities, which often is not available. So often we have a conversation with municipalities that says, we have budget space under the national procedures, but all we can spend is what we collect in local taxation. We have no access to finance. We need long-term finance. And often EIB is the first more than 3-year facility that they've ever had. And for the first time, it allows municipalities to start thinking about, outside of national programs, to start thinking about 10-year CapEx programs, which they've never had the capacity to do before because they've never had a financing facility for that long. And the transformation in the mentality of local authorities is astonishing. Suddenly politicians actually start to think beyond the next set of municipal elections, which is a great thing to see. So it's fantastic when we can do it. Yeah.
With my previous answer, so Ukraine found the very, I think, easy solution. We have in one hand our energy efficiency fund, but that the same national ministry that is making decentralization reform. So we put energy efficiency fund not at the Ministry of Energy, not at the Ministry of Economy, but at the Ministry of Regional Development. So that was the first step, how we connect the regions with the national source. So we developed the special loan programs, as I mentioned, warm loans, for example, or different loan programs, programs for equipment. But the point is that if on the regional level, local municipalities trying to do some very ambitious projects, for example, connecting with European Investment Bank or EBRD, we providing the state guarantee as an estate, and that's the answer. So I think that's a very easy way. First, some very focused, typical programs that might be source for different warm programs, and the second, state guarantees for the highly prioritized infrastructure or energy projects.
And Taban.
I think the local government has a very important role to play in this transition. And I think national governments, because normally energy is a national competency, with policies that limit the role of local governments in terms of the financing modeling, it's going to be critical that national governments begin to allow municipalities at a local government level to develop their own economic financial modeling that will make this transition easy. I used to be a municipal manager myself in my other life, and we buy electricity from the utility and we sell it to our customers. And that's how we'll generate and increase our revenues at a local government level. Now, if you want to change the model and begin to introduce renewables, you've got to tell us how are we going to generate the revenue stream as a local government. That was, in fact, that was our slash funding. And more often than not, we won't even pay our utility back the money for what we have taken from them. So if you go to South African perspective, you'll find that the majority of municipalities are owing utilities huge amounts of money. That was our financial strategy, which is not correct. So if you move to renewables, you've got to have a very clear financial strategy of how to accommodate the new approach at a local government without affecting the revenue base. Mm-hmm. And that is very fundamental. And I don't think we have done enough homework to create a conducive environment for municipalities to see the beauty of introducing embedded generation and the independence of municipalities to relax the challenge of the national grid by embracing renewables as one of their strategies. And how economically and financially will that benefit the local government structure? If we don't do that, we are compromising a very important strategic framework that we have created for ourselves at a national level without accommodating local government in terms of the implementation. And that could work negatively in the bigger scheme of what we want to achieve.
It's good to hear the national government perspective and someone who's also worked in the local government. So, Libby.
Yeah, so Breakthrough Energy Ventures is pursuing a little bit of a different model compared to some other venture funds, where we leverage the coalition that I described that's part of Breakthrough Energy, which is composed of several global companies from around the world. And then we also have, we work a lot with policy leaders as well. So we're not only investing in technologies that we think can be successful in a given policy environment, but we invest in technologies and business model innovations as well that we think are fundamentally the right thing and fundamentally important innovations for leading this global transition to a cleaner economy. And then we work with policy leaders to share what we've learned, to share our insights, and to identify any roadblocks in policy that are preventing some of these technologies from coming to market. On the local and municipal side, I'd just like to point out a couple of things that local and municipal governments can do that are not necessarily constrained by budgets or would require, again, a large investment. And that's a couple simple things, just regulation and then urban planning. So a lot of regulation that is controlled at the regional level includes building codes. A lot of building codes, particularly in the US and a lot of places around the world, for example, require that buildings are made of Portland cement. That's a very specific technology choice that's locked into a lot of building codes. In general, policymakers don't like to pick specific technologies, but this is one case that we've identified where a specific technology is written into the code. And we're now starting to evaluate a lot of different technologies that can reduce carbon emissions from the cement and concrete sector, and there may need to be some changes at local building code levels. This is pretty nitty-gritty to enable some of these new technologies to come to market. But again, this is a huge sector of emissions. Just from emissions from concrete production. The other one on urban planning, there are a lot of innovative business models around new transportation options, and that are catching on so quickly and are kind of attracting people out of their individual passenger vehicles to much more efficient modes of transportation. There are some revenue neutral, so cost neutral, and also revenue positive policies that cities and municipal governments can put in place around congestion, parking, things like that that will make the city more livable, more enjoyable, and reduce emissions globally, and will also reduce local pollution. So there are a lot of things, beyond just the big funds and the big budgets that are required that can make a lot of improvements.
And go faster. You
Absolutely.
get them fast up.
Yep.
Can I ask you this, because probably it's on a lot of people's minds. Do you see, we're from the same country, that this rollback under the present administration of regulations is going to be hurting in the long term in those areas?
I think the private sector really has the opportunity to lead. We've seen that in the United States, and we see it around the world. I think I'm so inspired by the work that we've heard from the ministers on the panel here. A lot of it has been around opening up the sectors to private sector innovation and investment. And I think we've seen that in the US. These sectors are open to private sector investment, and we've seen the private sector identify renewable energy as a positive investment, and they're going ahead and they're making those investments. So the current administration has rolled back, unfortunately we're no longer a part of the Paris Accord, and we've rolled back, the administration has rolled back some other kind of policies. However, we're seeing the private sector charge ahead and continue to have record-breaking deployments of renewable energy, and we're still seeing a transition to renewable energy generation.
And I can confirm that, if I may. So I found this yesterday from CBS News. I don't know if you saw that, Libby. It said that 12 trillion US dollars, that's $1 in every $4 of assets managed professionally, is now invested in portfolios seeking to be sustainable, responsible, and impactful. $1 out of every 4. And these investors are using online tools, free online tools, for example, fossilfreefunds.org, to be able to see if their mutual funds and their portfolios are indeed climate friendly. And the headline was, "Investors are fighting back." So confirming exactly what you're saying.
There's also a lot of investor preference that if people want to put their money to work, they want to put it to work for the outcomes that they want to see in their economy, not just financial outcomes, but the world that we all want to live in. And so we do see a very large investor base moving in that direction. And even beyond that, renewable energy is has a positive investment case today. So we see success breeds success, and it's a growing investment sector. And policy can certainly open up new sectors for investment. Some of the things that we heard about today, energy efficiency and the renewables work going on around the world, will open that up further.
I mean, certainly what we see from our perspective is very strong leadership at the city and state level in the United States. So, for example, the Covenant of Mayors, you know, Mike Bloomberg's initiative has now become an incredibly powerful global movement at the city level to drive the energy transition, and we're very much cooperating with that. So there seems to be different signals coming from different levels of the U.S. government. Yeah.
And speaking of local level, we're seeing now pressure coming from grassroots, the students and pupils who are now hitting the streets. Maybe you can say something about your experience in your country, South Africa and Ukraine, if you're seeing this, and if it's going to make the investor community concerned that that this pressure is going to they're going to have to maybe take another or a faster path towards those trillions. We've seen there's some impatience from the people who are on Twitter that we need it now. We need to get this money going now. We don't have time to talk about, discuss it, and do this first, and then do that next. We need to really move fast. And are you seeing that pressure where you are?
Yes, there is huge pressure, and I think private sector has a very important role to play. From a technology perspective, we need to assist our governments to make sure that the cost of technologies from a financial modeling perspective is mitigated. You don't want government to be under pressure to provide energy efficient technologies at a high cost level, because then government will have to subsidize more. So you need partners in these technologies that are very circumspect about the financial perspective in the process. Our experience is that in bid windows 1, 2, 3, and 4, the financial modeling was slightly a challenge. And this has put pressure on delivering to the grassroots, on delivering to people that cannot afford the services of these technologies, which work against our noble objective of using renewables against the supply of electricity through coal. So we've got to be very sensitive in that, and my plea will be to the private sector and technology architectures to make sure that the pricing component is also mitigated to some extent. That will make it easier to deal with the challenges at a grassroots level.
Thank you.
We do see pressure, but that's a positive pressure. That's a pressure that means drive. So actually, for example, the pressure on the government, Ukraine, was the reason why we changed the environmental impact assessment standards. So we are open for the dialogue, and for example, a lot of people who are making pressure from the NGO community or expert community, and in Ukraine we have a very strong NGO community, they are actually helping to government to be better, and we have an open dialogue. But what good is in Ukraine, I think, we have also very strong startup and IT community, and they making not pressure, but they making the real leapfrogging with a different decision and different solution. So I think here that's the question about the balance. In one hand, we should ready carefully and sustainably with our decision, because we have all responsibility. We should work with resilience of our decisions and what we are doing and providing. But at the same time, we need to be open for the dialogue and open for new proposals and solutions. That's why I think the right pressure is the great thing to be better and to develop your decision in the right direction.
The other thing I'd add is that this pressure is, again, a positive pressure. And I think we see this challenge as so large that we can't have enough innovators who are dedicating this energy, this pressure, to coming up with new solutions for the challenge, whether it's new technologies, in some cases those take years to bring to market, new financial structures, new projects to prepare that are bankable. So we all have a part to channel that pressure into a positive expression of opportunity. And to students who are coming out of school, who are excited about this space, it's never too early to be a leader in this field and to bring a new idea forward. So encourage those students coming out of this space to follow those ideas and shape them into something that's actionable.
So yes, we're also feeling a lot of pressure as an EU institution. We've actually just finished a consultation process on the future of our energy lending policies, and we do this about every 6 years. And this consultation process just drew more interest than we've ever experienced before. And it's from a new generation who are becoming politically and environmentally aware. And suddenly they see an opportunity to make their views known in an institution that has a large capacity like ours. And it is challenging because obviously we want to encourage it. But there's very difficult challenges being put to us, like why aren't you financing 500 billion of new investments every year? Why don't you completely stop financing any gas whatsoever? And these are things we're going to have to deal with. But what's clear is there's a new generation coming into politics, coming into industry, coming into institutions that is going to transform the mindset. It's going to transform the mindset of how we work. And we're going to have to take decisions a little bit more quickly and be a little bit more ambitious. So, in fact, I can't wait for a lot of these kids. We had kids protesting outside the bank there about 4 or 5 weeks ago. As part of, they came from the local schools to protest that we're still financing gas infrastructure, and it's an absolutely legitimate process. I can't wait till we can hire these people to learn through college, and if they have that same passion and drive and ambition, I want them working at the European Investment Bank.
Good.
And these young people, these driven, passionate young people are not only entering institutions, but they're also entering, as we mentioned before, the kind of retail investor class, starting to earn money, put some away in their pension funds and their 401ks in the U.S. and other things for savings, and they're making choices on where they want their money invested. They're small investors compared to some of the large funds around the world, but they are starting to make up those large funds around the world. They're also entering the consumer class, and they are seeking products and services that improve their lives but are also beneficial for climate change. So that's another thing to point out to young people who are entering the workforce and who are looking for an expression of their own energy, is to come up with innovations and technologies and business models that can also serve this new consumer class, because they are hungry for solutions that improve their lives and make a positive impact on climate change.
Very good. I just got the very sad signal that we're coming to the close. I would have liked to have gone on, but I would ask each of you, we can use those 5 minutes to get a final, what shall I say? Not statement. That sounds so. But push. You've been so positive and constructive that maybe, let's say, going forward into the 2020s, which is just around the corner, how you see things happening where you are. Natalia, I'll start with you.
I think for Ukraine, the most important thing is to keep the direction on the Euro integration, to keep our main strategy with implementation of the right things. So I hope we will follow up with increasing of renewables. I hope we will follow up with Paris Agreement implementation and low carbon development. So we need to be a bit all more responsible about what we will leave at this planet after us, especially in the energy sector. Thank you.
And we wish you a lot of luck with that.
I think we don't have an option. Renewables are here. We just have to develop strategies that are more sustainable financially and environmentally. It's not any other option that we have at our disposal. It's got to be done. We just have to make sure that from a financial perspective, the support is there, technologies are sustainable, and reasonable enough from a costing perspective to make implementation easier. And the governments of the world should stop talking and be more action-oriented in our policies. It's easy to talk, but doing is another. And I think we've been talking for too long, but action is very slow. In South Africa, we welcome all investors in Botswana, in Mozambique, in our SADC region as a whole. There's a huge potential to use renewables and technologies that will relax our national grids to make sure that we achieve the goals we've set for ourselves through the Paris Climate Agreement, of which the majority of us are part to. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanabe. Andrew.
I mean, I suppose my final message would be, obviously, institutions like the EIB and other public financing institutions, we need to up our game, we need to be more ambitious, but we will never alone be able to deliver the financing required for the energy transition. We need to crowd in private sector finance, we need to blend public and private risk-taking, we need to find new models for doing that, and we need to create the framework conditions that brings the trillions of euro of private finance into the energy transition. And we can play a role in that, but we need to change our mentality a little bit with how we work with the private sector.
Thank you.
At Breakthrough Energy Ventures, we see this point as just the beginning of a global transition to a clean economy, with new solutions across every sector of the economy that can reduce carbon emissions. And we think there's a huge role for innovation in business models that can open up markets for existing technologies, but then also an opportunity for truly breakthrough new technologies that are not commercial yet, to help with flexibility of the grid and integration of renewables, all the way to new sources of food that we put on our table, new modes of transportation that can move things around the planet in a carbon-free manner. And we look forward to working with the public sector, the private sector. Really, everyone has a role to play in this transition. Thank you.
Thanks, Libby. With that, I'll close this session, and I would ask you to give a warm round of applause for all of our panelists once more.